Good morning, good evening from time zones in South Korea, in Washington, D.C., in the United States. My name is Frank Januzzi, and I'm president of the Mansfield Foundation. I'm very happy to welcome you to today's program featuring Mansfield Senior Fellow, Andrew Yo, who is fresh off of research conducted in Manila, the Philippines. Today's program explores the South Korean government's new Southern policy, promulgated to promote greater cooperation with countries across Southeast Asia and India. This policy comes at a time when major powers, China, the United States, Japan, have turned their attention to competition for resources, for political influence, and for security across the Indo-Pacific. The Moon government's strategy, the new Southern policy, reflects the greater foreign policy autonomy of South Korea, as well as its own worldview that the South Korean government and the South Korean companies and South Korean people should be engaged well beyond the Korean Peninsula and globally, both to seek economic opportunity, but also to ensure Korea's success globally. The new Southern policy, however, comes against a backdrop of geostrategic rivalry between the United States and China, which colors everyone's perceptions of what everyone else is doing in the world and in the region. And so it has significance and consequence beyond just the future of South Korea. We are so delighted to have with us this morning, both to present his research and then to have critical analytic discussion, three distinguished scholars. Their bios and recent publications will be loaded into the chat box, but let me just say a couple words about each one of them. Andrew Yo is a longtime friend of mine and associate of the Mansfield Foundation. I know him best for his critical work studying North Korea, but in fact, his study of politics and his understanding of political science goes well beyond that. He's professor of politics and director of Asian studies at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., author of Asia's Regional Architecture, Alliances, and Institutions in the Pacific Century, which very much speaks to those geostrategic challenges that I was hinting at earlier. His research and teaching interests include international relations theory, Asian security, as well as how civil society contributes to politics. Dr. Yo is one of the disciples of the great Ezra Vogel, whose passing we note just in the last 12 months. In that he tries to attach his research interest to relevant public policy, which is also central to the mission of the Mansfield Foundation and our partner in this whole enterprise, the Korea Foundation, which made possible Andrew's sabbatical out in Manila, where this project came to light. Also joining us this morning, Dr. Yuna Oh. Now, Dr. Oh and I have only just met today, but I'm familiar with her work. She's assistant professor at the Graduate School of International Studies, Seoul National University. And she is a specialist on Southeast Asia, especially sort of the intersectional studies of political development with economic development, which is so critical across the region. You can see the consequences of political decision-making in Vietnam, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, as these countries each try to pursue their own pathway toward economic development and success. She is also a student of the interactions of all of these countries with China. Before joining GSIS, she was a fellow at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. So I'm looking forward very much to her comments about the economics and how the economics and the politics intersect. And also joining us this morning, old friend, Dr. Ji-Young Lee, associate professor at the School of International Service at American University, right here in Washington, D.C., but she's joining us today from from Korea, where I believe she's visiting family. Dr. Lee, graduate of Georgetown University with her PhD, is a political scientist, and she studies especially East Asian security issues and the intersection of history and East Asian area studies. And she's the author of China's Hegemony, 400 Years of East Asian Domination, Columbia University Press 2016. So I'm really excited that we have two wonderful discussants and a very skillful and dedicated and careful research-based scholar to present his analysis of South Korea's new Southern policy and what it might portend. So with that too lengthy introduction, but for our three very distinguished guests, let me also thank again the Korea Foundation and Associate Director of Programs at the Mansfield Foundation, Ms. Ari Lee, who has helped to make this entire program possible, for their support. And I will turn to you, Andrew, for your opening remarks. If you have questions in the audience, please feel free. We will be both fielding Q&A questions. At the bottom of your screen, you should have a Q&A function that you can use. You can, I believe, in this format, post to the chat box, and we'll try to be monitoring that for questions as well. And after Andrew's presentation and the discussion among the three scholars, we will turn to the audience for some questions. Andrew, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks so much, Frank. Good morning or good evening to those that are watching our event. I wanted to thank Frank and the Mansfield Foundation, especially Ari Lee, for putting together today's event, and more importantly, for hosting this research project, which was made possible by the Korea Foundation. I've been on research leave in Manila the past year. As Frank mentioned, conducting this research. I'm now in DC momentarily. I'm also really grateful to my two esteemed colleagues, Dr. Oh and Dr. Lee, for staying up late in Seoul to offer their expert insight. When I first approached this research topic in 2019, very few people in the United States, beyond close observers of the U.S. ROK alliance, were aware of South Korea's new Southern policy, which the Moon government announced in late 2017. U.S. policymakers were instead focused on escalating tensions between the U.S. and North Korea during a period of fire and fury, and then later fixated on two historic summits between President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un. It's therefore understandable why most policymakers in Washington were late in recognizing the new Southern policy's existence. The aims of my working paper, which I believe Ari has just posted on the chat box, and it'll also be posted online after this event. So in this working paper and our panel is meant to draw attention to the new Southern policy, or the NSP, within the context of the U.S. South Korea alliance and the changing Indo-Pacific geopolitical landscape. Since North Korean negotiations have essentially stalled from 2019, more experts have paid greater attention to South Korean foreign policy that extends beyond the Korean Peninsula. Meanwhile, in Seoul, the election of President Joe Biden earlier this year has kindled renewed interest, if not pressure, within the Moon government to do more to engage with the U.S. Indo-Pacific Strategy. The Moon government's NSP offers one such link to the U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific. My brief comments this morning can be parsed into three parts. First, I offer some background and rationale behind the NSP. Second, I discuss existing and potential connections between the NSP and the U.S. Indo-Pacific Strategy. And third, I end with a few recommendations for Seoul and Washington to consider in thinking about the NSP and its relevance in the Indo-Pacific region. So to offer a little bit of background, as I mentioned, in 2017, the South Korean government launched the New Southern Policy to promote greater cooperation with countries in Southeast Asia and India. Although the NSP is the first major initiative to advance South Korean interests in Southeast and South Asia under a single framework, external relations with ASEAN and India, respectively, had been gradually moving forward. Formal relations between ASEAN and Korea were first established in 1989 when ASEAN added South Korea as a sectoral dialogue partner. Ties were deepened after that, after the Asian financial crisis, with the creation of the ASEAN +3, institutionalizing relations between ASEAN and the three major Northeast Asian countries, China, Japan, and Korea. In addition to bolstering East Asian regionalism and improving multilateral financial cooperation between Northeast and Southeast Asian countries, the ASEAN +3 framework enabled South Korea to enhance bilateral relations with several Southeast Asian countries. ASEAN and South Korea signed a series of trade and investment agreements in the latter half of the 2000s that formed the basis of the ASEAN-Korea Free Trade Agreement. Deepening economic ties led to enhanced political and security relations, with the two sides forming a strategic partnership in 2010. Now, South Korea's formal relationship with India predates its ties to ASEAN. Bilateral consular relations were formed in 1963, with full diplomatic relations established in 1973. In 2006, India and South Korea launched discussions supporting the bilateral comprehensive economic partnership agreement, which came into effect in 2010. And South Korean President Lee Myung-bak's state visit to India that same month also helped elevate India-South Korea relations to the level of a strategic partnership. Despite making strides in diplomatic and economic relations with ASEAN and India the past 2 decades, South Korea's diplomatic profile and public attention to Southeast and South Asian affairs has remained relatively low compared to relations with the 4 major powers in Northeast Asia, those being the US, China, Russia, and Japan. Centered on 3 core pillars, people, prosperity, and peace, the NSP signals the Moon government's political will to deepen economic, cultural, and people-to-people ties with ASEAN and India. Now that we've explained what the NSP is, let me turn to some of its driving factors. I'll offer 3 related factors motivating the Moon government. So the first is economic diversification. In light of Chinese economic coercion targeting South Korea in 2017, the Moon government sought to diversify and expand economic relations beyond China. By relying more on ASEAN's export market and expanding trade and investment with countries such as Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand, Seoul reduces the risks of Chinese economic coercion and US-China trade friction. The second driver behind the NSP is untapped economic opportunities which exist in Southeast Asia and India that merit elevating these relationships. As stated by the NSP Presidential Committee, the NSP provides support for Korean companies to participate in infrastructure projects and make inroads into the manufacturing and technology sectors. So that's a direct quote from the NSP Presidential Committee. Southeast Asia is also a ripe market for South Korean food and beauty products, as well as K-pop and K-dramas. And just to give my own personal example, living in Manila, every time I go to Netflix, the top 5 shows are always Korean dramas. At first, I thought they were targeting me with their algorithms because they figured out that I'm of a Korean descent. But then when I asked my Filipino friends, they also said, no, these are the most popular dramas airing in Philippines. So there is a very large market, and I think an untapped market for Korean products and soft, popular culture within Southeast Asia and India. The third motivating factor behind the NSP is that it offers South Korea greater latitude and autonomy in its foreign policy decision-making. By sidestepping the free and open Indo-Pacific narrative, the NSP reflects a framework distinct from Indo-Pacific strategies adopted by the US and its allies, such as Japan and Australia. The Moon government has strategically left sensitive security and defense issues out of the scope of the NSP to reduce any risks of becoming entangled in a US-Sino standoff. So let me give some attention to the NSP and how it relates to the US Indo-Pacific strategy. So similar to Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy, the NSP expands South Korea's foreign policy priorities westward and to the south. Despite having eschewed the free and open Indo-Pacific language in its own regional strategy, the NSP provides ample room for cooperation on economic and local governance initiatives central to the U.S. Indo-Pacific Strategy, including energy, infrastructure and development, digital economy, and women's empowerment. The potential for overlap between the NSP and Indo-Pacific Strategy does not remain lost on Washington and Seoul. At the third ROK-US Senior Economic Dialogue in December 2018, the two sides discussed ways to work more closely together in implementing the NSP and the Indo-Pacific Strategy. The US State Department also acknowledged South Korea's NSP in its first major public report on the free and open Indo-Pacific in November 2019. That same month, the US and South Korea released a joint fact sheet titled, Working Together to Promote Cooperation Between the New Southern Policy and the Indo-Pacific Strategy as an intentional step towards coordinating policies in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The fact sheet integrated the NSP's three pillars, people, prosperity, and peace, with some of the key elements of the US free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. For example, under the NSP's prosperity pillar, the US and South Korea proposed areas where the two countries could promote prosperity through initiatives geared towards energy, infrastructure, and development. The same three issues the US had touted as central to the free and open Indo-Pacific's economic strategy. A year later, in August 2020, Seoul and Washington launched the inaugural U.S. ROK Indo-Pacific Strategy New Southern Policy Dialogue at the working level. Seoul and Washington discussed issues ranging from maritime law enforcement to cybersecurity to Pacific Island country cooperation. These points were further addressed in an updated joint fact sheet in November 2020 that covered transnational crime, counter-narcotics, water resource management, and natural disaster response, among other things. Although economic and non-traditional security issues are well covered, as you can tell by these joint fact sheets, traditional security issues have remained mostly absent from the conversation. Other experts also note that the NSP's peace pillar remains the least developed of the three pillars and devoid of a strong strategic dimension. So another way to put it is that there's a lot on the table from the NSP on people-to-people exchanges and economic cooperation. But when it comes to the peace pillar, aside from non-traditional security issues, there isn't a whole lot in the way of strategic thinking. And as one individual on the presidential committee told me, well, it's not the new strategic policy, it's the new Southern policy. So this has been, at least until recently, the attitude, I think, of the Moon government when you ask about strategic issues in the NSP. And this kind of makes sense because Seoul's development cooperation-oriented approach to NSP is in part a reflection of Korea's comparative advantage and identity as a middle power, built around its own rapid development experience and recent growth in soft power across the region. Given the underdevelopment of the NSP's peace pillar, then, it should come as no surprise that strategic ties between the NSP and the free and open Indo-Pacific remain limited to mostly these economic and non-traditional security issues. So finally, I want to just say a little bit about the U.S. South Korea alliance more specifically in the NSP, and then offer a few thoughts or a few recommendations. President Biden's election in January 2021 and preparations leading to the first Moon-Biden summit in May 2021 produced a noticeable shift in the Moon government's approach to the US Indo-Pacific strategy. So whether this was due to increasing pressure from the new Biden administration to join like-minded partners, or President Moon's own calculated shift in his approach to engaging a new US administration that would be very different from the previous one, South Korea has in recent months warmed up to the Indo-Pacific narrative. Rhetorically, the joint Moon-Biden statement offered South Korea's most significant sign of support for the US free and open Indo-Pacific strategy to date. And more importantly, an indication of Korea's own future role in the Indo-Pacific. For instance, the two sides affirmed that the significance of their bilateral alliance extends far beyond the Korean Peninsula. And that was a direct quote. It also states that the two sides also agreed to, quote, align the ROK's new Southern policy and the United States' vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, and that our countries will cooperate to create a safe, prosperous, and dynamic region, end quote. This includes Seoul's support for the Quad, and in a nod to the Biden administration's vision of sustaining a liberal international order, the two sides mentioned their opposition to, quote, all activities that undermine, destabilize, or threaten the rules-based international order in order to maintain an inclusive, free, and open Indo-Pacific, end quote. So, before there was a lot of argument that, South Korea does not like using this Indo-Pacific narrative or discourse, but you see the Moon-Biden joint statement, filled with the talks about this discourse with the Indo-Pacific. So despite the Moon government's inclination to find a balanced approach between Beijing and Washington, Seoul has over time articulated stronger support for the US free and open Indo-Pacific. The US and South Korea have already taken stock of existing development projects that support common goals and mutually reinforce peace and development objectives in the region. However, to align the NSP and free and open Indo-Pacific, I might give the following suggestions for Seoul and Washington. And I have more in the paper, but because of time constraints, I'll just maybe offer 5. So first, Seoul must consider the strategic and security implications of the NSP. So this again follows on top of other scholars' argument that more needs to be done with the peace pillar. Some issues covered by the NSP, such as infrastructure development, particularly as it relates to technology standards, carry strong strategic implications. Policymakers in Seoul should map out how its development strategy in Southeast and South Asia, as well as cooperation with the US and other US allied countries, might affect the regional strategic landscape. All this to say is that even if you think something like development cooperation or digital technology is not really, it's an economic issue, it's really at the end of the day a strategic issue as well. So I think South Korea and the US together have to be thinking about this from a strategic perspective. Second, South Korean policymakers must reassess their own regional role as a middle power. South Korea's identity as a middle power still rests within the framework of East Asian regionalism. But if Seoul wishes to amplify its voice as a middle power, both progressive and conservative policymakers will need to brand the NSP as part of South Korea's broader middle power strategy, rather than a framework for functional cooperation with only developing countries. Third, Seoul should pursue dialogue with countries that have adopted an Indo-Pacific strategy or framework on both a bilateral and multilateral basis. Although Beijing might react negatively to Seoul's greater engagement with Indo-Pacific countries, by dialoguing with actors beyond the US, including members of ASEAN and the European Union, as well as India, safety in numbers logic applies that would make it difficult for China to single out South Korea for punishment. So right now, the South Korea, when it discusses the Indo-Pacific strategy, it tends to look at it from the perspective from a bilateral perspective, but this is really a way to encourage the South Korean government to think from a more multilateral perspective and pursuing the NSP and linking it to other Indo-Pacific strategies. Fifth, and finally, I think I'll end here. The U.S. must be. This is a suggestion for the United States, but the U.S. needs to be smart about how it frames its Indo-Pacific strategy and its values-based diplomacy among like-minded partners. So rather than framing the free and open Indo-Pacific as a manifestation of zero-sum competition with China, the US should focus more specifically on common goals shared among Indo-Pacific actors, including support for freedom of navigation, international law, good governance, and improve access to COVID-19 vaccines. And I do think the Biden administration is doing a good job framing it that way, but oftentimes, especially in the media, the message comes out as free and open Indo-Pacific is equivalent to an anti-China coalition. But I think the US has to work hard to, I guess, counter that narrative in order to persuade countries like South Korea that are sitting that have to balance these relationships between Seoul and Washington. So I'll stop there, and I very much look forward to hearing what Dr. Oh and Dr. Lee have to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. You've given us a brilliant assessment of the NSP, and I'm so glad that you refrained from attempting to come down hard one side or the other with respect to whether the NSP is neatly aligned with FOIP, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific U.S. strategy, or whether it represents a kind of a departure or a removal from the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. You laid out brilliantly how the two strategies are in fact intertwined, and how there are opportunities for them to be well coordinated, but how they are also different in their priorities and their emphasis. And you described, I think, this development-oriented NSP strategy, focused first and foremost on economics. And it struck me as I was hearing you speak that this is also the area where the U.S. strategy is arguably most poorly developed, in that the U.S. did not join TPP. The U.S. has not moved forward with U.S. ASEAN free trade agreement. And so there's a little bit of a misalignment there with the U.S.
That's a great point, Frank.
Focused
Yes.
on the peace side, and Korea focused on the economic side. Dr. Oh, I'd like to turn to you first, since your specialty is in the economics. And if you can respond to Andrew's remarks and add your own insights, I very much look forward to hearing your views.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank Andrew and Mansfield Foundation for inviting me today. I have two comments focused on how to link the NSP and Indo-Pacific better. So I'll leave out how to understand NSP per se. So I'll focus on the policy recommendations part, right? So my first comment is, you may want to go back to the very motivations of the NSP. So as you have said, there are three, but I think perhaps you can say it's two. So the economic diversification and South Korea achieving foreign policy latitude, right? So I think that motivations you can sort of put in the context of this classical question or problem of whether or to what extent and under what conditions asymmetric economic interdependence translates into political power. So that has been the major foreign policy challenge for South Korea for the past 10 years in the context of the rise of China, right? So, and this, the need for South Korea to achieve a certain economic and diplomatic diversification is related to how we should evaluate the policy impact of NSP. And this is something I am interested in, actually. But going back to the diversification itself, I think now we have to ask, it's been 4 years of the NSP implementation. What has happened? What has happened to the diversification as a result of the NSP? So we can take a quick look at the trade statistics. So South Korea's overdependence on China in its merchandise trade and service trade, namely tourism, is often said to be at the heart of South Korea's dilemma in the context of U.S.-China competition. This overdependence created vulnerability to the, as you have said in the paper, to the fallout of the U.S.-China trade disputes, and also direct Chinese economic coercion in recent years, right? So, so how to deal with this vulnerability was the core motivation for the NSP to launch the, for South Korea to launch the NSP. But then after 4 years, if you look at the trade statistics, there hasn't been much change. So if you look at the trade structure in terms of the geographic distribution of South Korea's major trading partners, so if you look at the share of each country in South Korea's exports and imports, and the share of China, for instance, in South Korea's exports remains the same, around 25%, which is high, but then it hasn't gone down, both exports and imports. And on the other hand, whether the share of ASEAN or Southeast Asia has gone up, it didn't happen. So Southeast Asia or ASEAN did not take away any part of China's share in South Korea's trade relations. But of course, you can say, and for your information, Southeast Asia's share in South Korea's exports is 17%, and import share is 12%. The number remains the same for the last 4 years. And of course, you can say that it's been only 4 years, and we have to wait, right, to see certain measurable effect. And this is basically what the South Korean officials are saying. So they are saying what they have done is that they have laid a foundation for the medium and long-term transformation. But then the important thing is that the source of that vulnerability remains. So South Korea knows it, and China knows it, and every other country knows it. So that is one indication. So if we sort of, accept this fact, then maybe we can ask the question. So whether there is anything that South Korea or NSP or Indo-Pacific can do in this regard, because if you think about the key motivation of the NSP, right, and then something has to change, right? So if U.S. and South Korea can do something under this umbrella, so obviously there hasn't been many attempts to improve improve trade relations, right, between U.S. and South Korea over the past 4 years, but this issue has to be addressed, I think. And Andrew, I know that because this will really help South Korea to increase its foreign policy latitude, as you have said, right, to its policy-making autonomy. That will, I think, strengthen, actually, and take South Korea out of this bind because we hear the same story over and over again, but without any change in South Korea's basic trade structure, I think it will be hard to move the conversation forward. So Andrew, I know that you want to push the NSP's links with Indo-Pacific to a more strategic and security direction. So here I am saying we have to re-emphasizing the economic foundation of the NSP. And of course, at this level, you cannot really separate, right, economic from security dimensions. But I think there is something to be gained when we go back and re-examine the source of or where the NSP has come from in the first place. That is my first comment. And then my second comment is on the values or value-based diplomacy as a common ground between the NSP and Indo-Pacific. So this needs a bit of explanation. So first, if you look at the NSP Plus official policy document that came out this year, it clearly states that South Korea will continue to embrace common values such as democracy, human rights, and the market economy. And here is the kicker, but in tune with the political situation of the partner countries. So it's a clearly qualified statement, but so it's a very cautious language. So you cannot interpret this where at least the language is there, right? Human rights in democracy, but it's clearly, qualified. But now, of course, there are limits to what South Korea want to say when it comes to discussing human rights issues in a foreign country, especially in East Asia, because of the North Korea issue. So South Korea is very usually very careful not to be very vocal in a matter like this. But it was different with the Myanmar crisis this year, and I think that is something quite interesting. So I mean, after the electoral coup in Myanmar, and especially after the Myanmar military started to crack down and use the violence against the unarmed protesters, the South Korean government and the South Korean public became very vocal and proactive in condemning the Myanmar military. I mean, from the president and lawmakers and the Buddhist order and academic associations and civil society organizations, they issued statements, they raised funds, and they organized this public forum to discuss Myanmar crisis. And as you may know, the South Korean defense chief signed the international joint statement condemning the Myanmar armed forces for using violence against civilians, along with defense chiefs of U.S., Australia, Japan, and many others. And this is unprecedented in South Korea. And the scale and depth of the reactions from the South Korean public is something we haven't seen before. So I think this reflects South Korean public's heightened sensibilities toward democracy, human rights in the wider region, right? And this is something I think that should be noted. I mean, so I don't really have any theory at this point. I mean, why this happened at this scale, and whether it can be applied easily to other cases. But I think, I mean, to the extent that Indo-Pacific can be expanded beyond the, I mean, narrowly defined security issue, this common values is something that can be explored by both South Korea and the US. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oh. I'm struck by the fact that the economics first approach of South Korea to the NSP perhaps was inspired by a notion that through the economic links, other interests would themselves develop somewhat organically. And yet you have drawn our attention to the fact that, at least for now, the initial results of the NSP are not so dramatic in terms of alteration of South Korea's trade balance, although I think you would acknowledge that COVID certainly played a role here, and that perhaps the South Korean government explanation that the foundation has been laid and that we'll see the fruits of this investment later is not without some intellectual honesty. I mean, there could in fact be a lag between the adoption of the policy and the reorientation or the expansion of South Korean economic trade and investment activities across the region. But obviously a policy, if it doesn't yield, the measurable results, then we have to begin to question its efficacy. But I appreciate so much you're making the link between the economics and the security. And to explore that more, Dr. Lee, if you could please share your thoughts, especially on how this NSP translates into South Korea's global strategy.
Thank you, Frank, for your kind introduction, and thank you, Ari, for all the behind-the-scene efforts and Andrew and Yuna, it's a pleasure to be on the same panel with you on this very important topic. I actually find myself agreeing with a lot of points that Andrew, you're making. I find the policy recommendations to be very compelling, especially on the need for South Korea to have dialogues with those countries that adopted the Indo-Pacific strategy based on its own assessments of national interest and also reflections on the role that it desires in this rapidly changing role in this rapidly changing region. And I believe this has a very important implication for U.S. ROK alliance. I agree with some of the, I hear this also from our conversation that we often think of Indo-Pacific strategy within the, anti-China framework or narrative. And I think it's the same in South Korea as far as I can tell. This in popular dialogue, there's this almost image where South Korea may inevitably be entangled into an unwanted dispute between Washington and Beijing. And, I do see that in certain circumstances that there definitely might be some risk. And this is the fear that South Korea shares with many ASEAN countries, I understand. And I think this is where our new Southern policy can be potentially very useful, even when you think about security dimension. I was thinking how it is worth mulling over how these countries that have adopted the Indo-Pacific strategy, they, however they frame it, it really came from their desire to navigate and swim through uncertainties, not just about China's growing assertiveness in the region, but also, with the United States commitment, the uncertainties that they have, but the U.S. Commitment to the regional security and national defense for them, especially during the Trump administration. So, broadly speaking, I see that this strategy can be part of as much intra-regional development, their adaptation, as it is about, the typical understanding of joining the United States as part of, for its partnership building efforts. So I actually think that, this topic of alignment between, NSP and Indo-Pacific, I actually think that this could potentially be a solution for South Korea's China policy, as well as its management of alliance with the United States, a way to navigate U.S.-China strategic competition. And I'm aware that the question of more traditional security issues within the new Southern policy is an area where experts point out as missing. So let me actually focus my comments on this point, and I would, be interested hearing more of your thoughts on this point about making a more elaborate point on the link and implications for U.S. ROK alliance. And I think one concept that I think will be useful for us to think about this whole question is this notion of alliance cohesion. Basically is a function of the distance between, allies' goals, South Korean goals, and United States goals when it comes to, these two different, policy or strategy that we're talking about. So one, I actually think it's very important for alliance managers to have and start with a clear understanding that the United States-China policy has changed. We take it for granted, but this is big for U.S. ROK alliance management. If we think about this question of U.S. ROK alliance, the origin and the mandate for a long time, it was about North Korea, right? And China really, was not, what is China basically in the context of U.S. ROK alliance? I don't think there really hasn't been a lot of discussions within the South Korean context. And, I don't know how much discussion there is between US and South Korea. So it will take some time for alliance, to make an adjustment. And this is the moment to have a lot of communications and dialogues about this in, very kind of, frank way, I think. My own sense is that until around the Obama administration, basically the United States was largely operating based on this idea that economic interdependence with China is good for the United States, good for China, good for the rest of the world. But it's huge that this liberal assumption is no longer driving the United States dealings with China. And this will have a very important implications for U.S. ROK alliance. For example, the primary kind of focus right now, one of the primary focus right now is U.S. is urging its allies and partners to join its attempt to decouple from China, in the context of global supply chains, right? And as Andrew's paper discussed, I think South Korea's, and Yuna talked about this, New Southern policy is part of this larger trend in the United States and other countries, although the nature and other details may be different. It's about seeking to diversify its economic relations, right, from China to avoid the kind of economic coercion that we have experienced in South Korea and elsewhere, right? So in this regard, the summit meeting between President Biden and President Moon in May, and the two sides' agreements on cooperation and reorganizing supply chains shows, I think this is an example of the alignment between the Indo-Pacific strategy and the New Southern policy, although it may not have been framed that way. And I agree completely with Yuna that traditionally, these non-security issues are actually becoming security issues. Today, when you think about what are the sources of international security threats to the United States, it's not really, there is, but it's not, yes, there is that concern about direct external attack on the United States and its allies, but much more so. And a lot of attention is actually going to disinformation, cybersecurity, public health, economic coercion. These are security issues. And I think this is where there can be that convergence in terms of alliance cohesion can come from. So to circle back to my earlier point about having dialogue with other regional actors, including ASEAN, by joining, others. And I liked it how, Andrew, you talked about, we tend to think of this Indo-Pacific and NSP in a bilateral kind of context, but, if we actually increase how this is about creating global public goods where South Korean interests will be served as well as those of others, I think there can be some fruitful kind of dialogue. I actually really do think that South Korea can be very instrumental by working with others towards certain important goals that will benefit everyone. In the shaping of this, regional order, as opposed to, if you wait, you have to be kind of reacting to something that has already happened. But if you're actually working together with others, public health, how to deal with economic coercion, these things are important, national security issues. And I think, we have a pretty good track record between the United States and South Korea to work together, as shown in the public opinions and other indicators. So I'll stop here. Thank you. It was a great paper.
Thanks so much, Dr. Lee. I'm glad that you pressed Andrew, and I'm going to press him even further when I invite him here to respond to the two wonderful analyses. You pressed him a bit on whether the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy competition with China, is it just a question of framing? Andrew, you talked about the importance of not allowing that competition between the U.S. and China and the free and open Indo-Pacific and the Belt Road Initiative to be framed that way, that South Korea doesn't want to operate within an environment in which their cooperation with the United States is framed as anti-China. But isn't the free Indo-Pacific strategy anti-China? It looks to me like it's anti-China. And yet you pointed out, Andrew, that there was an opportunity for dialogue with other free and Indo-Pacific countries by South Korea. And now Dr. Lee has also underscored the idea that recommendation that you have in your policy paper makes sense in terms of exploring how and to what extent South Korea and other powers join in this free and open Indo-Pacific framework. And so I would like to start inviting you to respond, Andrew. If you could try to address, please, not just how the FOIP is framed, but how it is shaped, how it is actually shaped through its implementation, and whether South Korea is a large enough player, or whether South Korea, in concert with other middle powers and other participants, could actually shape the substance of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in such a way as to avoid that worst case kind of zero-sum thinking that you alluded to. But anyway, let me invite you to respond generally to the two comments, but also if you could try to address this question of framing versus shaping South Korea's role in the free and open Indo-Pacific. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Frank. And thanks, Dr. O and Dr. Lee, for your comments. I'll start with Frank's point about this framing or the narrative of the Indo-Pacific. And if we were to cut to the chase, is FOIP, is free and open Indo-Pacific, is it really about China? And I would say substantively, yes. But then, with this framing, then is it just is it a marketing tool, or is it a ploy to some extent? Yes, it is. But when I say, when I talk about why the United States and other countries need to be careful about how we build this strategy, it's because it may be about China, but in the past, I think when you had common threats, let's think about the Cold War. It was very easy to rally people. It was easy to rally the country domestically. It was easy to rally allies by playing up an external threat. We did this again for 9/11 as well too, with the Taliban and threats in the Middle East. But these days, I don't know how effective that strategy is by just talking about an external threat. So you could say, well, maybe the best way of building a coalition is to talk about the threat of China or Chinese aggression. That it may be true that China has become much more aggressive and assertive, but I think to really rally other countries together, because there's so much concern about China and there is a lot of economic interest, you really have to focus on what are the common goods, what are the common interests that can help form a coalition among countries, whether they're like-minded or not. I mean, we like to use the term like-minded. And so something like freedom of navigation, that's something that every country in the Indo-Pacific values, including China. And so if that's something that's very important, and adhering to rules and respecting sovereignty, then that's what you should build the Indo-Pacific strategy on, these common points of interest. Freedom of navigation is just one example. What about infrastructure or global or regional governance? These are also common points of interest that can be shared among the different Indo-Pacific countries or Indo-Pacific partners. So at the end of the day, yes, maybe it ultimately does point towards the anti-China coalition. That's the way China wants to frame it. They say FOIP means balancing against us or containing our rise. That's the way China may look at it, but I think the US can change that narrative, say, no, it's not about China. The focus is really on countries that have a shared common goals and interests, and building those and working to achieve those common goals and interests. And by extension, if it does work, if it's adverse to China, then so be it. But when you frame something around common goals, that's not something that necessarily excludes China. China can also be a part. China might have interests in infrastructure and governance, on climate change. Now, there's going to be different issues when it comes to territorial interests. I think that's why the South China Sea disputes are so thorny. But again, I do see a distinction, even though FOIP may be seen substantively as being anti-China in nature. That's not the way the US should build or market that strategy. And if you don't mind, I'll just quickly turn to the points that were raised by Dr. O and Dr. Lee. So on economics first versus shifting towards more traditional security issues, or it's economics versus the strategic emphasis of the NSP. And it may just be my own bias because the people that I hang out with or talk to in Seoul are also more security scholars. So they are always saying the NSP needs more stronger legs on the peace pillar. But I also think the reason why that recommendation is also given is there's almost a built-in assumption that the economics of the NSP has been beneficial, it's been working. But I think your points were well taken. I don't think we should assume that just because we now have the NSP, that trade has increased with ASEAN. When I last looked at the data, it was actually, honestly, it was from 2019. And when you looked at the 2019 data, I think there was an increase in ASEAN South Korea trade. Now, you mentioned over the last four years, and I honestly don't know what the COVID situation has done towards ASEAN ROK trade. I actually think it may have distorted quite a bit. I know just from Philippines, their GDP is down 20%. So the COVID, the pandemic and lockdowns may have washed out any potential effects that the NSP could have had on ASEAN ROK or even ASEAN-India relations. So I know it's often seen as a cop-out when government officials say, well, just give it more time or not enough time has passed. But I do think we will have to see, we will have to give a little bit more time because of the pandemic situation. But you're right, if the economics is not improving, and I also heard that they focus on economics because you can actually show progress. It's easy to at least indicate whether the NSP has had any sort of policy effect or not. How do you measure the efficacy of the NSP? And it's much easier to talk about economics than the strategic implications. If there is no economic impact, and that's a problem, and I'm sure the South Korean government will try to ramp up that aspect of the NSP. But assuming that the economics, the ASEAN ROK and India ROK trade relations go up and can fill in some of the void of whatever fallout exists because in China ROK economic relations, I do think that there's an opportunity to also think about bolstering the strategic elements of the NSP. And as Dr. Lee mentioned, these two things, I don't want to segment too much the economics from the strategic elements, because these days things like technology standards, supply chains, they're economics, but they're also strategic issues as well too. So we got to keep in mind that even though we talk about the economics, the prosperity component versus the prosperity pillar and the peace pillar of the NSP, these two things are very much linked. I wanted to briefly comment about the Myanmar and the values component of the NSP. I actually didn't really see much of a values component within the NSP, although I'm glad you talked about the NSP plus, but they do give mention to democracy or human rights, but with that qualifying statement. My sense on Myanmar, I also was pleasantly surprised. So it was actually a welcome surprise to see South Korea take such a vocal stand on Myanmar. They were the only Asian country to sign that defense, the defense chief's statement of solidarity on Myanmar. They were the only Asian country to do so. I also wondered if it was because they had some economic stake. I heard that they were was it Samsung or some Korean company had a stake. POSCO, that's right. POSCO had a stake, and so I don't know if that had pushed them to distance themselves from the Myanmar military, but that was a welcome statement, and I trust that South Korea will continue to wrestle with these issues. Certainly, civil society, I think, is willing to be more vocal and on these human rights and democracy issues. When it came to issues in Hong Kong and the national security law that was put in place, I know that on some university campuses there was protests taking place on behalf of Hong Kong citizens. So we do see this, and hopefully governments will. The South Korean government will also respond. On Dr. Lee's point about, I actually feel like we're very much in sync in our thinking with the NSP and how it converges with the Indo-Pacific strategy. But But I do want to highlight a point she made that I hadn't really thought about, and it's this idea that, in South Korea, there needs to be some updating and domestic thinking about U.S.-China relations. And for us, we take it for granted. It's obvious that U.S.-China relations has shifted. But in the South Korean domestic polity, for years, the modus operandi has been, interdependence with China, and that's worked very well for South Korea, but that's no longer the case. So how does that affect South Korea's own interests and approach to China, and especially when it comes to the alliance? I mean, I still think today the U.S. South Korea alliance in South Korea is very much seen as an alliance designed for contingencies with North Korea, and it's focused on the Korean Peninsula. And even though these statements, including the last Biden-Moon statement, has talked about using the alliance or thinking about the alliance from a much broader perspective, that also means thinking about the U.S. South Korea alliance in light of U.S.-China relations. And although I think rhetorically South Korea understands that, at the heart of South Korean strategic thinking and domestic thinking, I think there needs to be more updating, I think, on that perspective. And so as South Korea does that update, whoever is next in government, whoever is next in power in South Korea, I think there could be some kind of review process on this that thinks about, the U.S. South Korea alliance in the context of U.S.-China, the Indo-Pacific strategy, and then thinking about how the NSP then fits as part of that framework. So I thought that was a very excellent point made by Dr. Lee. So I'll stop there, and I don't know if
we have any
other responses. Mm-hmm.
We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to segue a little bit to some questions, good questions we're getting from the floor. And it really builds on what you were just getting at, Andrew. I think there are areas where infrastructure, pandemic response, freedom of navigation, I'm persuaded by your argument that these kinds of elements need not be contentious between the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and China's own development goals for the region. And they should be an area of common ground with the NSP and other nations that are interested in those common goods. And where we seem to get into more trouble in terms of divisions is when we move into the values-based diplomacy. And we have a question from the floor with respect to from G.A. Kim about are the South Korean verbiage about a region that is sharing common values and the qualification language that is a part of that, is that really aligned with an American vision of a region that is safe for democracy and which underscores the democratic process and democratic governance? Is there a divergence there? And to me, that is also linked to the question of whether the origins of the NSP, in its policy origins, was it designed more for the narrow purpose of expanding economic markets and economic diversification, or was it in its conceptualization also a values-driven initiative? Is there a divergence there? And if I could get Dr. Lee and Andrew and then also Dr. O, if you'd like to comment, could you address this question of values within the NSP and whether it's a sign of potential divergence from coordination with the United States? Maybe Andrew, if you want to start. I'm sorry, I think you're muted. I apologize.
The NSP, it really was not designed as this values. I mean, there's this mention of values-based cooperation, but that wasn't in its original design, or if it was probably more of an afterthought. I do think that it was primarily focused on the economics, but over time, as there's been input and feedback, and I mentioned that there's a presidential commission, it's within the Blue House, even though the implementation, I think, is pretty much Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other ministries, there is this committee in the Blue House, and they may have thought that it may be important to give at least some attention to a values component if you're more forward thinking about where the NSP is heading. So it was my sense is it became more of an afterthought. But to Dr. Kim's question of whether it's something that, let me go back to the original Q&A question. When it goes back to whether they're moving in the same direction. I mean, traditionally the U.S. has been more open and forward, front and center when it comes to talking about human rights and democracy, not just from a global perspective, but even domestically, of trying to push for change to support civil society groups internally. And that I don't think that's something that South Korea it can't be. They can move in the same direction as the United States, but they probably can't do the same exact things that the US will be doing. But that's not to say that when there are issues that come in place, like women's empowerment or pursuing local governance, anti-corruption activities, these are activities that are in South Korea's interest, especially if they have investments in countries. So it may not be about talking about human rights and democracy front and center, but there's certainly things that would support the rule of law, good governance, things that we would expect in a liberal society that South Korea can certainly encourage, that would also be in its interest. And that's where I think you can find some convergence between the United States and South Korea. But I suspect South Korea won't be leading, they would be more following, I guess, the US in this direction, just because, and that's just the nature of, I think, the power disparities between the two countries.
Thanks, Andrew. And Dr. Lee, can I ask you to weigh in on this? Can't South Korea, even just by the power of its own example, reinforce democratic values? I sometimes feel we underestimate the impact of South Korea's own democratic transformation and success as an example to its neighbors. Sometimes you don't need to speak the words. Sometimes you can just walk the path and still reinforce and support good governance, democratic values. I don't think we should underestimate South Korea's power of example in the region.
I don't know if I actually know the answer, but I'm thinking that this element, again, as part of South Korea's regional role, probably has not been high on its priority in terms of policy objectives. I see that North Korea is very much on top, but then if you think about the narratives of democracy and human rights, right? So I don't know how it's gonna work, so yeah.
And Dr. O, we had a question from Mark Mannion that was related to my question about the origin of the NSP, and I just want you to also maybe clarify on this. To what extent do you think that the chaebol and South Korean business was one of the drivers of NSP, or were they just sort of brought along by the government on a policy prescription that was derived more by the thinkers and policymakers, or was there a economic business-led impetus, to help create this NSP?
So, I mean, I have to guess because I don't really know what happened when the NSP was formulated. But I mean, to the extent that South Korea as a state was, and I still think it is the so-called developmental state. So it has a strong element, I mean, of promoting Korean businesses abroad. I think that is still in the mind of the many bureaucrats, I mean, high-level officials and working level officials, and even many intellectuals. So I think when NSP was formulated, this promoting economic opportunities was a big part. And actually, that was, how South Korea oftentimes has tried to sell NSP to the South Korean public, that it is commercially beneficial to South Korea. In addition to all these strategic and perhaps cultural and cultural purposes. So I don't think it is useful to say that it was the input from the businesses that NSP was set up in the way it was set up, but it was something that was given the structure of the South Korean economy and its tradition so that's how I would put it.
In the time remaining, I want to turn our attention to the sustainability of the NSP. And it's playing off a question that Dr. Andrew Oros has posed in the chat box. I remember when the pivot to Asia was announced by Obama, that there was the intention of the United States to reorient strategic assets and prioritization toward the Indo-Pacific. And yet, at times, we witnessed how events in Syria and refugee crises in Europe would draw U.S. attention back to the Middle East. Andrew points out that North Korea has been relatively quiet the last few years with respect to commanding strategic attention from the South Korea and the United States. But we cannot depend upon that to remain the case. And South Korea's ability to pursue the NSP as a middle power, how contingent is that upon continued relative stability on the peninsula itself? And especially since China looms large in its role on the peninsula. And South Korea's pursuit of its southern policy, often in concert with the United States, we have witnessed the ways in which it might complicate South Korean-Chinese relations. So if I can just ask each one of you to sort of talk about your expectations of the sustainability of NSP and 5-10 years from now, what you expect in terms of how the new southbound policy may have shaped South Korea's relations in the region. I know that's a big question, but we have just a couple of minutes. But let me ask you to start, Dr. O, and then Dr. Lee, and then we'll give the final word to Andrew to wrap up. But Dr. O, is the NSP going to be sustained by the next South Korean administration, and will it endure as a South Korean strategy?
I think so. It may be under a different name, but then because Southeast Asia and South Asia as well is critical to South Korea's economy and the people-to-people ties. So, and then as I have said, and Andrew has cited my paper. So what NSP does for the most part is to give a name, give a recognition or status to the already important South Korea and Southeast Asia relation. So it will continue, but then perhaps the actual banner may change and the structure may change, but then it will remain, I think.
Thank you, Dr. O. And Dr. Lee, can NSP exist in alignment with South Korea's efforts to manage events on the Korean Peninsula with the United States? Can it survive and have enough policy attention if North Korea begins to act up again?
I tend to agree with Yuna that there are enough mutual interest on the part of, South Korea and Southeast Asia, and also the momentum, whatever different name the next administration might give to that effort. I think this is not super, politicized kind of, government activity. So I would assume that it will continue. There's going to be continued attention given to that efforts that, building on what, South Korea has been able to do. Now, in terms of I think the question points out how, pointing out how when, basically the top leaders' attention will go to certain issues, then other issues, there's the bureaucracy. So there's going to be continued kind of activities going on. And I think it actually is significant that South Korean government created separate institutional mechanism whereby even without the direct attention coming from the Blue House, there's that institution, that bureau that can continue and carry on. So I would assume that the efforts will continue. What's less predictable is actually North Korea policy.
Mhm.
Thank you. And Andrew, that brings you back to one of the
Yes.
specialties, but I will leave it to you to wrap up with any concluding remarks that you have.
Sure. I mean, to Andrew Orris's question, hello, Andrew. It's not coincidental that the new Southern policy in the Moon government it didn't really ramp up until after all this North Korea stuff went down. But to be honest, we don't know if the NSP they'll keep the name New Southern policy in the next government. But certainly, I think the relationship with ASEAN and India that's been built under the Moon government and even preceding the Moon government will continue to build because there is enough interest between Korea and ASEAN and India to sustain itself. And South Korea really has to think beyond North Korea and the Korean Peninsula. There's actually been some criticism towards the Moon government that it's overemphasized North Korea policy to the detriment of other policies out there. And if South Korea wants to be more forward-looking and thinking about its own future and its own strategic interests, and it has to think beyond the Korean Peninsula. So, I do think the next government may not have the same kind of laser-like focus on North Korea engagement as the Moon government, and maybe that might give more space to sustain policies such as the NSP. But I do think that there is going to be that this will continue even beyond the current government. So I think that's a good stopping point. I know, Frank, I'll bounce it back to you to just wrap up.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, Yuna Oh, Dr. Ji-Young Lee. I am in your debt for really stimulating discussion about something that Andrew began this morning by pointing out that not a lot of folks in Washington could have told you what the NSP was or really took great note of it at the moment of its inception. But as we witness the unfolding power dynamics in East Asia, the competition, rivalry between the U.S. and China, and the alignment of states like the Republic of Korea and Japan as they try to navigate these unsettled waters of the Indo-Pacific region, the importance of the NSP, I think, looms large as both an economic initiative by the South Korean government, but also one which has strategic dimensions to it. And I feel I understand it a little better now after your presentation and after the wonderful commentary by our two scholars, Dr. Oh and Dr. Lee. So I want to thank you for illuminating this really important South Korean government policy and what it portends. I want to thank Ari Lee at the Mansfield Foundation for arranging this program. And I want to thank the Korea Foundation, both for sponsoring Andrew's research project and for their strong support for the Mansfield Foundation and our programming examining Korea and its importance to the Indo-Pacific region. And with that, we are adjourned. Thanks so much to all of you. 감사합니다. Thank you all.
Thanks, Frank.